Hello and welcome to this Affinity photo tutorial. Now this tutorial is going to be a beginner's look at, to a certain extent, colour, but mainly looking at fill and stroke. Now before I start the tutorial, I just want to point you in the direction of another tutorial. Now admittedly this is an Affinity designer. Quick Start is aimed mainly at beginners for Affinity Designer. It is very long, it is almost 2¾ hours long, but it's made up of little individual lessons, sort of all joined together. But why I'm pointing you towards this is because there are so many features that are available in Designer that work just as well in almost exactly the same way in Photo. So this is a good place to pick up some tips for Affinity Photo, even though they are being done in Designer. And this particular lesson that I'm sort of trying to adapt for Photo is one of the lessons within this. So this is why I want to point you towards this. It's well worth sitting down to watch it. I mean, I myself have only got to 1 hour and 3 minutes into it, so I've still got a lot to watch and hopefully pick up a few more tips myself along the way. So, getting to the tutorial, we have the first quick look at colour. Now, up here in the right you have the colour tab, and by default it should be black or white. Now the round disc that is at the top, what is known as like the foreground colour, and the one at the back is the background colour. So if you want to make white your foreground colour, you just click on the disc and that circle will now be at the top. So white would be the foreground colour. So there are many ways to sort of look at the colour that you are picking, but if you wanted to change the colour, you can double click on whatever disc is you want to do, either foreground, background, whatever, and it will open up the colour chooser. Now I think by default it always starts on hue, but there are other ways of looking at it. Quite a lot of people like the colour wheel. I personally do not really get on that wheel with the colour wheel, but basically if you want a green colour, so you click down here in the green, and then you can click and hold this and then sort of pick a darker green or a lighter green, and the colour that your cursor is currently over is displayed up here. So if you watch that while I move this, it will get lighter or darker depending on where we are within that section. Also at the same time, down here you've got the RGB codes, which some people prefer to go by. So as you can see, as I'm moving this around, the RGB code is changing. But also is the hex code, which I quite like using in tutorials because it's so easy to just give the number 2A 5E 25, for example. So that is the hex code for that particular colour that we are on at the moment. Now in this particular colour chooser, you do get the RGB code and the hex code options available in pretty much in all the versions. I think you've got the sliders, which you can use just by changing the colour, be it hue, saturation or luminosity. And the RGB sliders, again you can move this around, pick a colour you want, and then you will have the RGB code or the hex code displayed. So that is how you can change the colour in the options from the colour chooser. Let me just reset those back to black and white. Now I have made up a keyboard shortcut to change mine back to black and white. I made a video about this quite some time ago. There is also a colour picker, which is this sort of eyedropper symbol up here. It is also available from over here, and if you double click on this, it is also available on the colour chooser. But basically you just click on the sort of pipette thing, keep it finger held down, and then as you drag out, whatever colour is in the sort of centre point, although the areas outside the centre point will have some influence, but you can pick from anywhere, not just within the main area, but you can pick from anywhere, even from outside of the Affinity program. You could pick a colour from anywhere on the screen. So let me pick that colour, and then that colour should be then selected and put into this circle up here, and then if you double click on that or single click, it will convert whatever the foreground colour is into the colour you've just picked. So that is how you can sort of alter colour from the colour panel up here. Let me just put this back to black and white. And there is also a way of changing colours by using swatches. Again, you've got the colour picker up here still, but you can pick the different swatches, but that is a totally different video altogether, so I won't go too much into that. So, getting to the main point of this tutorial, which is fill and stroke. Now, fill, if I come to the rectangle tool, when you click on any of these shaped tools, up here on the top you get two options. You get the fill and the stroke. And I think by default it's always like fill is white and stroke is black. Now the fill is, if you draw a rectangle, the fill will be the main colour of that rectangle, so it would be white. So if I draw now, you're not going to see it because I've got a white box on a white background. And the stroke is the outside edge colour, which at the moment, because this is the stroke options here, it is set on none. So although the colour is black, it's set on none, so you cannot see the outside edge. If I come off this tool, as you can see, it's just not visible. So if we alter the width of the stroke, as you come up, you can see that that black line is now getting thicker and thicker as you draw and alter the width. You do have some other options down here, mainly sort of altering the corners, because at the moment I think it's got square corners, or no, slightly rounded corners, so you could make them squarer or slightly round. I think this is the inside options here. You can also make other changes, but sorry, I'm not going to go too much into the changes there, just that you can make alterations mainly to the width, and by default it is set on a continuous line, but you can change that to a dotted line, and again changing the width will change the dots. Right, and there is another option here which is texture line style. Now in the designer tutorial that I mentioned earlier, when they clicked on this, they could go to the brushes and pick like a textured brush, and that textured brush would change the style look, the stroke look. Now I have tried this in Affinity Photo, and it didn't seem to have an effect. So that part doesn't seem to work the same in Photo as it does in Designer. So I will put this back to being a solid straight line. So that option must be available for some other one of these tools, but not the one I'm particularly on at the moment. And I've had a look in the help file and I can't see how that part works, but I will get around to looking at that at some point. Now you can also alter the corners, because I think that bit there might be the inside corners and for letters, but you can alter the corners, which by default on this particular one, because obviously a rectangle has got sharp corners, whereas the rounded one would have rounded corners, a triangle would have sharp corners, for example. But you can change those from this option up here, so you could change them to have rounded corners, and then you can alter the percentage of that. You can have straight corners, concave, and cutout. So I'll put it back to its default. So they're the main options for the stroke. Now, to change the colour of either the stroke or the fill, you just need to click inside one of those, and then you have the options of either none or swatches. So you could just click on a swatch and fill that with whatever colour you select. You could come to colour, and then you could select the same sort of options that you had over here with the colour tab. So for example, the colour wheel, which will work in the same way as I showed earlier. But here you don't have like the options for putting in hex codes. For that you'd need to go to the RGB hex slider, and there you can enter the hex code, or you could enter the RGB code depending. If you come to the RGB slider, you could enter in the RGB code rather than hex codes. So that is how you would change the colour of the fill. And then, like I said, if you click in the stroke box, you could change the colour of the stroke either by entering codes or just clicking somewhere and dragging around in here. So you can, then you'd have your RGB code there, or your hex code on the hex slider. So that is how you can change the colours of either the fill or the stroke. Now again, you don't have to just stick with solid colours. You can make it a gradient. So let's go with a linear gradient. So you can see it's this stroke colour is now white on the left hand edge and sort of blue on the right hand edge, and where you move this middle point is where the gradient will go from blue to white. But again, you could change the colour of the either end of this by just clicking in the box, and then you have the same options as you did when changing the colour before. So you could change that to yellow, for example, so that now goes from yellow to blue. And you could add extra nodes and have all sorts of different variations. So that is how the different fill and stroke works on a shape that you can make. But it does work with other tools. Say for example text. If I just draw this and put Affinity, let me move this down here. Now the fill and stroke options have moved from the left over here to the right when it comes to text. and by default most fonts are black in the fill and have no stroke, but you can change this easy enough just by selecting a color that you may want. Let's say green for the fill, and change the stroke from none. Click inside this and change it from none to a color. Let's go for a dark blue, and because it's very low at the moment, 0.2, you can't really see that, so let me just increase the width of that stroke so you are affecting the letters that way. So as you can see, it works on shapes and it works on letters. It should work similarly on the pen tool, because up here you can see you've got the fill and stroke have moved back over to the left side, and I could start a new one and go from there to there, for example. And as you can see, let me increase the size of this. It has used the same gradient that I had previously set up, but you could then change this from either the fill color or the stroke color. I think we've lost the fill color because the stroke has got so wide that it's sort of taken out the fill, but I mean, you see what I mean. I've just done that for demonstration. So that I think that's pretty much the only tools that use this in photo. I think more tools use it in Designer, but I think it's just the text, the shapes, the pen tool. I don't think the brush tool does, because the brush tool options are selected, color options are selected from here. So let's pick a brush, a basic brush. Let's have a bigger one. Let's try that one. And the color, let me reset this back to black and white. And I need a layer to put this on. Let's try that one. There we go. So the color will be altered for the brush strokes from up here rather than a fill and stroke option, because there is no sort of stroke option as far as I can see for the brush tools, although I think there might be in Designer but not in Photo. Right, so let me just delete these layers so that we've got a clear screen, and the next tool I want to look at is the gradient tool. And let me just add a layer here. Now, although it looks like there is no fill and stroke options here, they are set here. You can set the context we've got here. We set fill, which at the moment is set to none. So let me draw a linear option, so you're setting the fill to linear. So let me just Control Z and get rid of all of those. Well, this is where you can work in conjunction with some of the other tools. So I'm going to draw this new box here and reduce this stroke down to something visible but not too big. Let's go with 10, just over 10. So I'm going to come back to the gradient tool, and if you remember, we've now got a rectangle that's got a white fill with a blue outside. So we're going to add the fill option, and we're going to go with, let's go with a radial. So as you can see, this is only affecting the fill, it's not affecting the stroke, and it's not affecting the outside area. So you can click into this box here, you can change the colours much like you did with the other options. Let's try a nice dark red like that. So you have altered the fill. If you want to also add a gradient to the stroke, you can come to this context menu and click on stroke, and then we could add, for example, a linear gradient to the stroke, which at the moment is like a solid blue, but we could go and change one into yellow. Let me come off that tool a second. So using the options from the gradient tool, you can affect either the stroke, and you can make it a solid or a gradient, or you can affect just the fill area, be it a solid or a gradient of some sort. So the options in the gradient tool are probably more advanced than sort of all the other tools individually, because you can make it solids or fills or gradients and affect either just the stroke or just the fill and not affect the background. So I think that is the end of this very hopefully quick and informative look at colour, fill and stroke. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.